The history of city building in the West is very much two epochs punctuated by a great open space between the two of them, this great period of urbanization during the civilizations of Greece and Rome, followed by 5 centuries, 6 centuries until city building starts again in the medieval period. And of course, that second period of city building is one in which you have both the rise of political cities like Paris and very much, though, the rise of commercial cities like Bruges or Florence. China is different, right, in the sense that it has millennia of unbroken city building with the occasional sack or destruction of a major city. This sort of ancient and unbroken nature of city building is just sort of totally fascinating from a Western perspective. We're used to thinking of Beijing as being this great, politically driven monolith, but of course Beijing is hardly the first great capital city that China is.
No, it's actually rather late in history, I think beginning of the 1420s.
So where should we start?
If you want to go way back, we can talk about the city as administrative center, as sort of pivot of the world, where the emperor is both a religious figure and a secular figure, that he is the axis mundi, he connects the capital with heaven and so on. But I think the most interesting place to begin is when we see the giant capital emerging. And Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty, 1 million inhabitants perhaps, a grid city laid out, a totally administrative city, but also if you look at its location, with 1 million people concentrated in one area, how is it going to be fed? In fact, there are cases when drought hits that area where they have to move the capital because they can't support it. It depends upon a tax system. It's an administrative city. And if you then look around say, well, where's sort of the hierarchy of urban places that would support a city? There are not so many. It's really, in the Tang Dynasty, there's one big urban center. And if you go back in time to the Han Dynasty, where the administrative capital is there too.
And that's when it has its roots, right?
That's when it has its roots. The city has shifted somewhat, but that's where it has its roots, as the administrative capital. But the very fact that the city has shifted, that the outlines of the Han Wall, let's say, and the outlines of the Tang Wall are different, makes a point that, in fact, there is an interregnum. There is a period when urbanization and cities largely disappear from the Chinese scene, and the capitals are very small.
And how long is that?
Probably, I'd say, it goes on for around almost 400 years. From the fall of the Han Dynasty, something like the fall of the Roman Empire, until the reunification by the Sui and Tang at the end of the 6th century. And then that capital gets built again. You can look at a map and you'll see that the capital of Tang, Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, is a grid. Everything is laid out, the capital in the north, the main central avenue, all the parts of the city are divided into wards, and each ward has its own mini wall around it. The capital itself has a giant wall. Each ward has its mini wall, has its own gates, its own supervision. The markets are located in an East Market and West Market. It's a very different conception of urban space than
a more open city, a more commerce-oriented city would be. So you mentioned its modern name of Xi'an. Of course, when Westerners think of Xi'an, we think of one thing, which is those terracotta warriors, right?
Right.
But even that is, in some sense, reminding us of its very roots, right? It's built by the first Han emperor on space that was used even earlier.
Right. And the terracotta warrior would be the Qin emperor who unifies China and makes his capital there.
And why are they choosing that location?
Well, if you look at where it is, it's sometimes called within the passes. As the Yellow River comes down, it makes a sharp turn through a pass in the mountains. And if you're located to the west of that pass, in some sense, you're independent and removed from the massive population on the North China Plain. But you're also closer to all the foreign tribes of the north and northwest that threaten you. And yet you're in a valley, a fairly fertile valley, the Wei River Valley. And in that sense, it's a secure place, but it also reminds you that right next door are the people that want to attack you. So it's a strategic location in many ways, both domestically and internationally.
You know, the location of a Western city that reminds me of is Milan, which was, of course, Mediolanum, which is northern, closer to potential enemies of Rome, and also has the benefit of access to the passes that run through the Alps.
Yes, a perfect example. And in fact, if we were to take that Italy parallel further, we start to think of the north of Italy and the south of Italy. We can start to think about the north of China as being much more defensively oriented. and the south of China as being much more economically oriented.
Right, which again makes your point of a very political city, of a city that's driven by war and power. And now, what was the thinking behind the grid system, and why were there so many walls? So having a single external wall, I get that. There are bad guys outside, or there may even be a peasant uprising or two that you need to protect yourself against. But why so many walls within the city?
That is an interesting phenomenon. The city is divided into these neighborhoods called Fang, which are rather large. And I think part of it is a notion of social control. The Tang is a dynasty that believes that somehow there can be a unified hierarchy of wealth, power, culture, status, and the capital is the center. In some ways, the capital of Tang is national culture. And if we were speaking about America today, and you think about American culture, you talk about New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, maybe Atlanta, Chicago, all over the place. In Tang, you talk about one place, and that's the capital. But that would change.
Unified culture, politics, religion as well?
To some extent, or yes, because the emperor becomes the patron of all religions.
Right. In some sense, it's more like the French situation, in which Paris is also at the absolute epicenter of.
And there's this French sympathy for China and this notion of this unified hierarchy very much.